Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are. My name is Michelle Loy, and I'm part of the WWF-Singapore's Sustainable Finance team. I'm your moderator for today's webinar. We will dedicate most of our session today to a panel discussion where our experts will share insights from their own experiences and practices on climate action, impact, and net zero. You will have the opportunity to ask questions to our speakers, so do keep them coming using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. If there's a question raised which you would like for it to be answered, you can upvote it. Now, I would like to start with a short poll to get to know you, our audience, better. The poll is anonymous, so I will encourage you to participate. Each poll question will be open for 30 seconds for responses. So you should see the poll come up on your screen about now. So the first poll question is up. There's about 30 seconds to respond to the poll question. So the first poll question is, what type of organization do you represent? Just want to have a sense of the audience that we have today, from which organizations, type of organizations you're from. So there's about another 10 seconds more. Do participate. Okay, we're closing our poll. And let me just share the results with the audience. So in terms of organization, we see that we've got a balance of asset manager and banks, and also some from others or organization might be an NGO type of organization. So good, we've got a few different types of audience here, participants, and one from corporate too as well. So let me go on the next poll question, which you should see pop up about now. So again, 30 seconds for choosing a yes or no. So is the lack of well-defined disclosure regulations a key challenge in your climate journey? Obviously from a organization perspective. So the easy yes or no, whether do you see that as a challenge for you or as a barrier for you as you navigate through your climate journey? Okay, just another 5 more seconds. Okay, and we are closing the poll. I'm sharing the results. So, well, mostly no. That's quite interesting that we see that it's not a challenge. And we can talk a little bit about that if you have questions on that front, because often than not, we see, at least within Asia, the capital markets being so fragmented, there is different regulations across the region. So sometimes that's a barrier. So no worries, we can go on and see the remaining questions, and you can raise your questions as they come up later during the session. So let's go on to poll number 3. It should come out on your screen now. And so poll number 3 is also a yes/no question. Has your organization set science-based net zero plans? So, okay, ending in about another 10 seconds. For those who haven't responded, about another few more seconds to go. Okay, and we are closing the poll now. So yes, I've seen almost a half-half, almost 60% have not set a science-based net zero plans. And 43% has, but that would mean that there's room for more to do and more to learn, and which I guess why most of you are here today. So let's go on to the last question for poll. And the 4th question for poll is also a yes/no question. Does your organization assess or measure the real-world impact of your climate action? So for those who are in the journey of measuring your impact, in your climate journey, do you measure or assess in any shape or form the impact of your actions or your strategy that's carried out? So a couple more seconds, and we are closing about now. And so, okay, interestingly, 80% said no, you don't assess the impact of your climate action. So that's good to know. I just want to get a flavor of the audience, experience and knowledge, and also how your organization is dealing with some of these aspects of climate action as well. So I'll stop sharing now. We're ending the poll. So in terms of agenda, we'll start with introduction and context, then the panel discussion, which will take most part of today, and then we'll end off with a Q&A. So let me start off by giving you some context on our WWF and 2DII, which is 2 Degrees Investing Initiative joint study, exploring barriers to the implementation of impactful climate actions by ASEAN financial institutions, which was released in December last year. And a lot of us know that climate target setting is becoming increasingly popular. We see large-scale commitments that were pledged towards climate finance. But these pledges and targets are often focused on portfolio alignment goals, and the extent to which that they may be used as a form of measuring or assessing the contribution to changes in the real economy is still uncertain. And in WWF 2021 annual response report, an assessment of Asian and European asset managers, we found that Asian asset managers are taking important steps to build their responsible investment, or in short, we call it RI, capabilities. However, there is still room for improvement to accelerate their ambitions and practices to match current best practices in RI and contribute to driving real world tangible change. And so to tackle some of these issues, we set out to uncover what are some of these inhibitors that limit the success of these ambitions and actions for Asian FIs. We provided recommendations for policymakers, financial institutions, financial supervisors on the most effective ways to foster further contribution towards the low carbon transition. And so I wanted to spend some time on this particular element or rather the topic of portfolio alignment versus impact. That's often a confusion around there. What does each really mean? So in terms of portfolio alignment, in simple terms, it's the composition of a financial portfolio in which the average investee company at the portfolio level is on a transition pathway, and that's aligned with the Paris Agreement. And in terms of impact, having an impact on climate goals, it merely means a reduction in real-world greenhouse gas or GHG emissions of companies. And here it's really about making changes happen. Now, to align your portfolio, you can do 2 things. One, you can engage and try to impact the companies in your portfolio, or you can reallocate. Often, when we hear about alignment goals, reallocations are what happens. And perhaps it's because it's easier to do that than directly impact or engage with companies. The reallocation of the portfolio from high carbon to low carbon companies, which is known as portfolio alignment, is presented as leading to emission reductions or known as impact, but this cannot be substantiated. And this, in fact, then leads to green or impact washing. But it does not mean that you shouldn't reallocate when you have no other choices. For example, when coal companies that will in any case not change their activities, simply that it shouldn't be the only lever that you consider, as most often seen in the cases of climate pledges. Now, moving on, I won't spend too much time on some of these actions that we studied during the report itself, but I want to just show you some of the areas that we considered. The examples here are hypothetical, just for reference and not our study findings. So I'll leave this for your reading when we send out the slides separately after the webinar. I want to spend a little bit more time here in terms of sharing with you the high-level report findings before we go on to our panel discussion. So during the study, we found that Asian financial institutions surveyed, consisting of asset owners, asset managers, and banks, they have begun their climate journey, but obviously on a different level and different sophistication levels. So they acknowledge collectively that more climate actions are needed on their part and as an industry for more significant impact. However, none of the surveyed FIs seem to have an overall impact strategy outlining how impact on GHG emissions is accounted for in their activities. They also shared, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, the limitations of their current actions to effective impact strategies. And there are a few, but I've just listed two for today's purpose. We can share a copy of the report for your further reading if you like. One of it's low levels of expectations of the investee companies through their engagement process, or for banks through their loan covenant design to drive real-world changes. The demands are mainly centered around increasing disclosure and improving risk management. These are really important, but not sufficient. And secondly, the lack of tracking of climate performance and escalation strategies. They acknowledge the FIs that they need to be better at tracking impact results. And often not, they prefer a collaborative approach than a confrontational approach when they deal with investing companies. So as the FIs progress along their responsible investment or climate journeys, there are challenges which inhibit them from stepping up. And we bucketed into two aspects, the internal and the external barriers. There are more obviously in the report, but for today I'll list out and go through two. In terms of internal barriers, we've seen some FIs mention that there needs to be a strong justification or conviction within the organization for climate action. Sometimes they find it quite difficult without clear evidence to be able to convince the senior management that there is outperformance or profitability for the organization when it comes to climate action. And secondly, cohesiveness of climate strategy from a both top-down and bottom-up perspective, resulting in a limiting business organization where you don't get a cohesive organization moving together as one. And kind of wrapping up on external barriers, lack of clear regulations, and no surprise here really, to define impact products, where there's a need for more supporting policy environment, particularly in marketing regulations. And lastly, the need for robust systems to track granular data, climate performance, and transition plans at a company level. And based on some of these barriers, we provided a set of 4 recommendations for the finance sector to lift them. So now, without further ado, I think what most of our audience are looking forward to is our panel discussion. Let me introduce our speakers today, and may I invite our speakers to turn on your video. So for today's speaker, we've got 3 esteemed guests. Idris Boy, she's the head of ESG research at Maitri Asset Management. She's responsible for developing and maintaining the firm's proprietary ESG integrated investment framework and practice. Next, we have Soed Kolai, Impact Program Manager at 2DII. She coordinates the program's projects, which aim to assist FIs in designing scientifically sound climate strategies that contribute to the Paris Agreement goals. And lastly, we have Anders Noheimen, SVP of Asia's Sustainable Finance Team here at WWF-Singapore. He works in partnership with Asian FIs to build capacity, produce assessment, and also advocate for change that directs finance towards sustainable activities. So welcome our panelists. I'll stop sharing screen now, and everyone should see our panelists on screen. Okay, so maybe let's start off by just a very, very easy question, just talking about the landscape for climate action in Asia. So we know that Asia is home to about 60% of the world's population, and it's also one of the most vulnerable regions to the impact of climate change. This region has seen an increase in pledges like many other regions, and also regulations focusing on specific environmental engagement and policy announcements surrounding climate risk and mitigation. But because of the regional, cultural, and also economic development differences that needs to be considered, the ASEAN countries have yet to find a solution to this. So maybe the first question to Idris and Anders, maybe Idris, you could start off first. There is clearly a green growth in the market, and I would say we are in a marathon, right? Trying to stay within the boundaries, the planetary boundaries. In your view, what are some of the factors that are driving an accelerated focus on climate change in Asia? And how do you see this translating into real world impact in terms of reduced emissions?
Yeah, good day, everyone. My name is Edris, Head of ESG Research at Maitri Asset Management. A pleasure to be here today to speak with you about climate impact on investment portfolios, and also very privileged to have an opportunity to share a case study in this WWF report. So a bit of just a one-liner background on Maitri and why we are so passionate about this is Maitri's single largest beneficiary is a charitable foundation. Therefore, responsible investing is really a very big part of our DNA. So back to Michelle's point about why we think based on our observation there's green growth. I would boil it down to two factors. One is the statistics that Michelle was also talking about, as well as the statistics that we can see in this report. The credible scientific studies show, right, the impact that climate change has on Asia. And the resulting bill or damage that's done on the countries within Asia, the governments are the ones that have to find the budget to fix all this. And of course, their budgets are getting tighter and tighter. They have to get the funding to try and solve these problems and to repair all these problems from a much broader base, rather than just relying on government funds. And when we think about it, when no one is responsible for a particular issue, it means that everyone is responsible. So, with the climate agenda, really, there wasn't one particular country, one particular company that was solely responsible. It was really a global issue, and it is a global issue that we have to then find a solution for. And I think that what that translates to is the get is that most of Asia's countries do not really have a very strong carbon reduction strategy in place that can effectively mitigate the climate risks that we are seeing. I believe that from the investor perspective, there are actually two main investment opportunities that will help to create this impact to reduce emissions. The first one is investing in clean tech. Okay, and then the second one is whatever company that we're investing in to put climate criteria on any industry. So with these two, the second one I think we'll be talking a lot more on the second one later today. So, for this part, I'll just wrap up by sharing a bit more about, what are the investment opportunities in clean tech within Asia. Coming out of the COP26, there was GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It was expected or estimated that 125 trillion US dollars will be spent between last year and 2050 to achieve the net zero target. 1/4 of that is expected to be in this decade. Out of the 32 trillion, 13.6 trillion will be spent in APAC alone. And out of APAC, we're looking at China and India taking more than 10 trillion within this decade. And if we were to further break it down, we're talking about green steel, which would take a pretty big chunk. And private actors, which is the investors, we could actually provide up to 70% of all of these financing. So it's definitely the clean tech space is a huge space for us. And later on, I'll be talking a bit more about the second lens that we can put on our investments. Thanks.
Thanks, Idris. Anders, over to you and share some insights.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michelle, and thank you for having me on this panel. I mean, I think Idris brings up a lot of excellent points in looking at what the sort of origins of the growth is and how that's translating into impact, and maybe just building on some of the conversations that we also have with financial institutions in this region is the increased focus on physical risk. I mean, increasingly, financial institutions and people in general are seeing, feeling, experiencing the effects of climate change in terms of physical risk. And we know that that's going to get worse and more frequent. So I think it's starting to become a bit more perhaps personal. In addition to that, and of course that then has effects on the businesses that they are invested in. In addition to that, especially this year, last year, we saw a very heavy focus on these international agreements. We had the climate COP, we had the first half of the biodiversity COP, and we know that these commitments by countries in this region, by financial institutions and by companies are going to translate into different expectations. And in some cases also translate into regulation. I think this is also why financial institutions are increasingly looking at climate risk and opportunities, and also where a lot of this growth, this almost explosive growth in green investing that we've seen in these markets. Now, whether that translates into real world impact, whether that actually has a translates into emissions reduction, real emissions reductions, especially in markets that are continuing to grow, is the second question. And this is where a lot of the uncertainty lies in the market. And I think a lot of financial institutions, not just in Asia, but also in Europe, with supposedly more advanced markets, are struggling a little bit to measure and communicate the impact, the real world impact that they might have. And this is something that we've seen also through the results of this study. Michelle.
Thanks, Anders. And I think that segues quite nicely into the next question or next aspect that we want to talk about. Is a little bit more about the report. So let's talk about the report. So while barriers to delivering climate impact in Asia were investigated during the study, the report provided solutions as well for financial industry actors to aid in strengthening their climate strategies. And we talked a little bit about Europe earlier, and I think it segues quite nicely because we've got Suet, who's based in Paris, and obviously have a lot of interaction with the European financial institutions, but yet at the same time, it's also one of our lead authors of this study. And so maybe let's start off with Suet yourself. Based on your experience, are there certain report findings which stood out to you distinctive to just Asia? And are there certain key takeaways you wish to share with the audience? And the same question to you too as well, Anders.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks for having me in this webinar. I was glad to participate to this study, and actually based on the results and the findings of this study, yes, there is like findings that are specific to Asia in a way that most of the respondent actually they started the sustainable journey quite recently, and based on that, the climate actions internally remain marginal in the overall strategy of most of the surveyed FIs. So like the first step that have been undertaken by the surveyed FIs were mainly about like building internal RI capabilities, like developing dialogues with their portfolio companies, but none of them like seem to have like an impact strategy that outlines how impact is accounted for in their activities. So most of the respondents also like acknowledge that in their responses that they will need to step up their actions to significantly impact climate change through GHG emission reduction. But it seems like there is like several barriers that are getting in the way of like more ambitious climate actions. What we noticed based on the findings or the results of the study is like one of the barriers is about like lack of tracking of climate performance, as you mentioned, Michelle, in the intro, like tracking of climate performance and also escalation strategy. What we noticed is that in the case of like engagement, one of the actions that the FI are undertaking, all the surveyed FIs tend to keep their engagement like collaborative and do not move to a more proactive or activist or confrontational strategy, engagement strategy, even actually when climate KPIs are not met. So of course, when we talk about like divestment or publicization, these should be kept exceptional, but sometimes it's necessary to achieve impact. This was one of the barriers that we noticed, and one important barrier also that we noticed based on the findings is actually about the extrinsic profitability objectives and the question in general of fiduciary duty. So the question here was mainly about how legally like feasible is it for an asset manager to include GHG emission reduction in the definition of profit maximization. So it was an important barrier that we wanted to tackle with a recommendation also in the study. So based on that, we made some recommendation that just wanted to highlight two of them as a takeaway also of the study. Like, so based or regarding the barrier on the lack of tracking of climate KPIs, one recommendation is actually about requesting the portfolio companies to set up a carbon accounting system, detailed transition plan that actually shows and outlines how the company will decarbonize its activities. So it's also for the FI to adopt a strict escalation process to incentivize the action. And also what can be like requested is like a mandatory extra financial reporting for companies. This could be implemented also by regulators. So companies could ask to report on how their activities depend upon the use of natural capitals, and also what costs are associated with this use. Yeah, so another recommendation that is related to this profitability and fiduciary duty question. I mean, there is the need for asset managers to not compromise the financial gain of their client is often like a reason not to take impactful action. So for the cases when like fiduciary duty like is a kind of an obstacle to impact, one recommendation could be like that the FIs could engage with regulators to push them to take over part of the cost of the action to kind of normalize the impact product. But in this case, we should be cautious that the responsibility of the impact of the action taken will shift from the FI to government or a regulator. So a more like systemic solution to this barrier, to this fiduciary duty barrier could be like to apply prudence to not only the financial capital of the client, but also to the preservation of the natural and social capitals that actually enable the very existing of the financial capitals. So these are like one of the recommendations that we made in this report, and these are like one of the takeaways of this study. Michelle.
Thank you very much, Suet. So obviously we can hear Suet was very close to the project and near and dear to her. But Anders, you also participated in the report itself, and having spent quite a bit of time in Europe, does any of this surprise you, or any that you want to call out for our audience today?
I think Stuart gave an excellent overview of the findings and some of the recommendations behind it. And for me, it's not terribly surprising to see that Asian financial institutions are perhaps, in general terms, at a different starting point than, say, most of the European ones. Doesn't mean that there aren't financial institutions in Asia that are really doing excellent work, but it's maybe less common than it is, for example, in Europe. Some of the elements that have been brought up, such as lack of supporting policy environment, and also lack of climate tracking systems, are also things that we see in conversations with financial institutions. And these barriers are things that can be addressed by the market and in collaboration with government. There's also some cultural differences that come out. in terms of how, or traditions, there are different traditions in how investors perhaps use their voice or their engagement capabilities with investee companies in Asia, and we see that also reflected in the report. Some of the perhaps surprises or excuses that remain are things like the profitability objectives and fiduciary duty, the lack of a business case, the liquidity. I mean, to me, these debates are over. We know that there shouldn't be any barriers in legislation to incorporating ESG issues into your investment decision. In fact, it makes for better investment decisions and therefore better outcomes for the clients. And the business case for incorporating climate risk especially has been quite clear for some time now. So at this point, it's a bit surprising to still see these coming. And for some financial institutions, there's maybe a little bit of a need to provide a bit more education around how these climate risks manifest themselves into their decision-making and into the assets that they are invested in. Michelle?
Yeah, and I agree. And obviously, they need to take a more holistic lens at looking at it instead of in silos. I would just like to advise and recommend the audience to please type your questions in the Q&A section instead of the chat. So we do have some questions in the chat, but please put it in the Q&A so it's easier for us to and the panelists to take a look from there. So if you could, there are a couple of questions on the report in terms of coverage, whether we cover China. We can talk about that a bit later in the Q&A section. And I think there is a question for Idris from Irene also as well. We can touch on that in the Q&A in a bit, just to make sure that we go through the flow and not disrupt and stop halfway. So thank you, Sued and Anders. So let's move on. As we've mentioned earlier, portfolio alignment is commonly misunderstood as impact. But herein lies the challenges and also opportunities for evaluating the impact of climate actions in the real world. So you may notice an improved portfolio GHG emissions profile of a company year on year, but it could possibly be due to reallocation actions of the portfolio. For example, you're divesting from a carbon intensive company, which is great for carbon footprint, but may not necessarily lead to an increase in climate impact. So it's crucial that assessing and accounting for climate impact becomes a core activity of the investment cycle or process. So going back to you, Sued, there clearly must be in the industry or in the market some tools and approaches where can help the FIs to evaluate the impact of their climate strategies and also move the dial in terms of real world emission reductions. In the report, we do cover certain aspects of it, but 2DII is also experienced in this space given the research done. Will you be able to share some insights?
Yeah, actually, like we know that like with climate target setting becoming like increasingly trendy, and like with the surge of initiative and frameworks focused on climate related targets or strategy are like are coming up. So as you mentioned in the intro, Michelle. However, I mean, most often these targets are actually focused on portfolio alignment goals rather than impact goals. So we know that alignment goals, like from an exposure logic perspective, are quite relevant for many reasons. And from the risk management perspective, from risk perspective, actually, they are quite relevant. But to the extent to which they can be used as means to contribute to change in the real economy is not sure, actually. It's still quite uncertain. So there are various actions that like a financial institution can undertake to maximize its impact potential, but not all of these actions have the same chance of succeeding. So based on the scientific literature, there is like a set of action with highest level of evidence of effectiveness that can be implemented by an FI to actually maximize its impact potential. And the report like covers some of these actions, such as the engagement or offering conditional capital. So now the question is, for an FI who wants actually to implement this action, how to proceed, how to integrate this action in internal impactful climate strategy to maximize the impact potential. That's actually what we are missing in terms of framework. We encounter a lot of framework that are like alignment framework, but at TDR we developed what we call the climate impact management system that actually answer this question about how to integrate these climate action in internal impactful climate strategy. So basically this framework is like a process. The goal is actually to help and guide FIs in setting up like climate strategies that are made to have an impact in climate change mitigation. And this is done by like drawing on existing scientific work. So how this works, these are like, there are like various steps in this SIMS or climate impact management system that actually assist or guide the FIs. So there are steps where the first step is actually for the FI to understand the current situation, and the tools that could be used in that case could be like alignment tools such as PACTA that we developed at 2DI. And at these steps, beyond like just assessing the alignment, is also about identifying what are the current actions that could be implemented. While this is done, the FI can then define the real world changes that the FI would like to trigger with this action at company level. So there could be here like an assessment at company level to also know where the FI stand in terms of the scoring of the portfolio companies. Then after like defining the action plan, it's about reporting on these actions so their effectiveness can be assessed, and also like continuously revise and improve the climate action implemented. And actually this process overall with these different steps can be like applied at the whole institution, like at the entity level, and can be applied at a branch level or at a product level. So yeah, so this is like the approach, one of the approach of framework that developed at 2DI that an FI can use actually to maximize the impact, its impact potential. Michelle.
Great, thank you very much, Swet. And I'm sure a lot of the attendees will be curious to find out. So we'll share those resources after the webinar itself. So let's move on from that to net zero, which is really talked about. It's almost in every sustainability conversations you have these days. In terms of net zero commitments, it's almost universal. Per net zero tracker, it covers almost as much as 90% of global GDP right now. But the quality of these pledges across the countries and companies are currently insufficient for us to reach our global climate goals. And further, many of these targets plan to use offsets to achieve climate goals. And it's kind of unclear about the inclusion of scope 3 emissions, for example, and also accountability of achieving targets. In June last year, WWF released an introductory guide for FIs on the 5 criteria for credible net zero commitments for FI, which we can circulate later. But in the industry, there's also other frameworks that's quite often used and talked about as the net zero investment framework by IIGCC. And also more closer to home, guides like the Hong Kong Exchange Net Zero Guide are commonly referenced as well. So leading to the question, this would be one for Idris from a financial institution perspective, I guess. In terms of hard to abate sectors, setting net zero targets for them, it's not easy. Are there some guides, guiding principles you would recommend for FIs to consider as they embark their journey in tackling some of these hard to abate sectors?
Right. So also addressing some of the points that Suan and this brought up, right? For Maitri, we target competitive market returns, especially for our sustainable funds. And I started off answering the first question by saying that there's actually 2 strategies that we can invest in towards climate investing. One is clean tech, and then the second one is overlaying an ESG lens or a climate criteria on any investment that we make. So right now, I'm going to be elaborating a lot on that. So it would also cover the hard to abate sectors. I think to begin with, there is a myriad of benchmarks and standards for investors to choose from now, from internal measurements all the way to external disclosures. Personally, I have been a sustainability professional in Singapore for at least 10 years. And 2021 was a year where I saw ESG progress more in 1 year than the 10 years I've seen combined. So all these benchmarks and standards are new. Investors also have to digest it at an alarming speed, right? And some of these reports can go up to hundreds of pages. New acronyms come up with each new climate meeting. The TCFD, SBT, TPI, GFENS, NZAMI. And so I would say to choose and start with internationally recognized benchmarks, something that's credible, something that's well used, something that is started by financial institutions for financial institutions is usually a good starting point. And I think it is worthwhile to start with a framework that is considered the gold benchmark, even if my FI currently today, I don't think I can achieve it, because sustainability is a journey. And in a way, we'll never get there. It's something that evolves. Humanity evolves. Our technology evolves. Our impact and consequences will also evolve. But I think it's very important to take that first step and start. And I think in the long run, it is more conducive to start with a gold benchmark in mind than to start with something that is easy but less recognized. Because something that has longevity will stand the test of time. And it means that your internal infrastructure as an investor, your frameworks, your investment decision process making, the data that you gather, the data points, it is going to be a lot more, it will last for longer. And there won't be an opportunity, the opportunity cost will not be as high. So an example would be, even if I don't understand the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the way to get started is understand the big picture of what the TCFD is trying to get at, right? Understand what is transition risk, physical risk, chronic risk, things that can affect the business, right? And honestly, right now, the cart is ahead of the horse. And everyone feels like, oh, I have to get started before I even understand it. Why is there this push? Because the climate emergency is here. Okay, there's no escaping from it. So of course the cart is ahead of the horse, and we haven't started before, and so we have to start today, or we have to start yesterday. One of the things, or one of the benchmarks that we use at Maitri is the NZAMI, Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. And it started by the network partners. So Maitri is part of the Asian Investor Group on Climate Change. It is the Asian Asian partner or network of the IGCC Investor Group on Climate Change, which is based in Europe. They were the ones that came up with the Net Zero Investment Framework 1.0. And it helps asset managers like Maitri to develop targets, right? They tell us or give us some guidance on the different ways that we can actually evaluate our portfolios and how we can actually create impact. And in this NZIF 1.0, they're very clear about it, that divestment is a last resort, right? So I think earlier when Michelle was covering the PowerPoint presentation, Sued also talked about it, right? Divestment is one way, but it's kind of like the easy way because it's something that investors can control. But in order to create impact, it means we must influence. And of course, influence is the long game. It will require a lot more effort and require a lot more time, but the impact is more lasting than if we were to divest. So I also talked about engagement and collaboration versus investors collaborating together versus direct engagement. So for Maitri, we use both. And a case study that we put out on the WWF report is the one that we collaborated on. We also do our direct engagement. And the difference that we have noticed is when we go as a group, our efforts are recognized as a group. The companies respond to us because we are a group, and our AUM is much bigger, our voice is much louder. And if we think about it as well, or rather from our experience, is if we have if we approach a company and we ask them to reduce their emissions or set more ambitious emissions target, another investor also does the same thing separately, and we are not aware. And then at the end of the day, the company does something. Who does that impact can be attributed to? Is it Maitri or is it another investor? And I think if we were to think about it that way, one of the things I mentioned earlier is if climate agenda, the climate emergency is not created by one party, and every party needs to be part of the solution, then really the attribution, it's not that it shouldn't matter, but I think the priority really is to recognize that let's, push ahead with this agenda, do the engagement, whether it's collaboratively or directly, and then we can try and figure out the attribution later. Because it doesn't mean that we can't proceed. And if we were to talk about, carbon offsets, actually the NZIF is coming out with a 2.0 version very shortly. But in short, investors, when we manage our portfolio, we should not, according to the NZIF, we should not allow carbon offsets, especially for sectors where feasible, viable alternatives are already available. Because what we are trying to do is to create an impact, to influence companies to actually set ambitious targets and try and achieve that. So in the long term, carbon offsets, okay, yes, they have a role, but what we're really trying to target is creating that impact. Yeah, back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Idris. And I think you segue quite nicely into the next question that we have about carbon offset. So at this point, maybe I'll have Anders and Suet to just quickly share their thoughts around the use of carbon offsets to reach net zero goals. And, are there some quick pointers that you could share in terms of how FI can build some of these credible net zero commitments? Suet and Anders, one of you could start. Just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, maybe I can go if you mind, Anders. It's a good point. I mean, to talk about the carbon offsets, like what is like this offsetting we're talking about? It's actually allows polluter to meet their emissions target by purchasing certificate that supposedly represent like avoided emissions or removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Unfortunately, like more than like 2 decades of experience with regulated offset schemes show that like this simple concept behind the offsetting is kind of flawed. So avoided emission offset are particularly problematic as they are like based on concepts that are like an emission in one place can be like zeroed out if an emission is avoided somewhere else. So no one can ever be certain that the emission elsewhere was in fact avoided because of the scale of carbon credit. So all that to say is like for financial organization to have like a credible and robust net zero commitment, from my sense, like it should start by first like stopping new investment in fossil fuel supply as stated by the International Energy Agency, and actually engaging actively and proactively with the portfolio companies to actually help them transition. So yeah, that was my just thinking about this concept of offsetting and having a robust and credible net zero commitment.
Sure, thank you very much, Suet. Anders?
Yeah, I mean, just building on that, I think it's almost too early to talk about offsetting. As a consumer, maybe you can talk about offsetting because you're buying things that fail to provide the necessary reduced emissions today. So say you take a flight or you take a railway journey and you want to offset that because the company isn't doing it yet. I think for producers and therefore related to investors, what we really need to focus on is, between now and 2030, we need to cut emissions by 50%. That's our job. And that's what we need to focus on. Then from 2030, we need to 40, we need to cut it by another 50%. And that's what we need to focus on. And I think from 2040 to 2050, maybe the discussion will be around some of the residual hard to abate ones in some industries like steel and industries that are necessary. But to talk about how you're going to offset residual emissions in hard to abate industries in 2050 now is, I think, a distraction. I think we really need to talk about real world emissions reduction, and that's where our attention needs to be.
Thanks, Anders. And I think that quite nicely rounds up the panel discussion. And I think you have one of the audience agreeing with you, right? It's quite early to talk about that. And so we had that question in because obviously it's much talked about, and there is obviously the CIX building out in Singapore and around the world. It's been talks of carbon offsets, and so we thought that we just wanted to have that in as part of today's conversation. But we do have some questions from the audience that hopefully we can take the next couple of minutes, really about 8 minutes or so, to cover. The first one was to Idris. If I'm reading the question correctly from Irene, I think what she meant was SBTI, around SBTI and Maitri in terms of investments in Asia. Does the question make sense? Idris, shall we get Irene to?
Right, I think maybe I'll answer it this way. I think, what does Maitri look for, and how do we do our investments in a net zero perspective, and particularly when we look at investments in Asia. I think I'll address it in two ways. So the first one is, what's the framework that we use? So we don't use the SBT, we use the Net Zero Investment Framework, NZIF, very much because as part of an investor group, we definitely support and we agree with a lot of the research and backtesting and the way that the rationales are being done with the IGCC and the whole network partners. And when we look at the NZIF, they look at portfolio and asset level for scope 1 and scope 2, and for corporate issuers. So when we translate that to our investments, and then if we look specifically at Asia, I would say that for scope 1, scope 2 emissions data for Asia right now, there is more and more, increasingly, definitely. But whether or not that data is being verified and audited, that's another issue. And I think it's a journey. I think we recognize that Europe is ahead of this sustainability journey, and it doesn't mean that Asia can't catch up or can't be ahead in certain things. And I think when we look at data, I actually did see a report. A news article on Bloomberg just today, where I looked at European companies that reported on this to the CDP for the past 10 years, and out of which 30% of those companies were actually found to have mismatched emissions reporting. And out of those companies, actually about 39–40% of those companies come from the oil and gas sectors, right? And so these are companies that have been reporting for more than 10 years. And still there is a bit of discrepancy or in terms of the expectations of what the emissions numbers are supposed to be like. So I think for Asian companies, we do have to be more comfortable with disclosing our numbers, be more comfortable with internally reporting those numbers and then getting them disclosed and then audited. In a way, we might not have to struggle with a lot of the interim issues. They would have already been sorted out, such as meters or frameworks for different sectors. I think they would have already been sorted out by the early reporters of emissions. So right now, as investors, we really push the data providers to give us much better quality data. Data providers and investors, again, push the companies in Asia to come up with better quality disclosures. Yeah.
Thanks, Idris. And I think Irene responded to as well, taking a step forward, it's more important than not doing anything and just waiting for regulation to hit you. I think some of the other questions that we have either on chat or separately messaged to me, there are two questions on the work that we've done on the report. So Suet, I'll just answer and then you can add on. They wanted to find out, I think it was Rakesh wants to find out if there are survey responses from China. No, we did not have survey responses from China, but we did from other parts of Asia. And also the comment in terms of, if we did have responses from China, whether we should have looked at it from a China lens. I think I get where you're coming from, potentially because, we had this conversation with some China financial institutions, and they are of the view that obviously they have a 2060 goal versus a 2050 global goal. And some of the work that they do in their institutions are not in lockstep with what some of the global organizations are doing. And even if it's a global organization, sometimes they may need to tweak their initiatives and strategy for the specific China aspect of it. So I think that's what you meant, Rakesh. There's also another question in terms of the report. Whether do we have plans to have recommendations to include references to GIN or IRIS framework, which we know that it's commonly used for reference in terms of impact investing. In terms of the report, obviously we've concluded the report with the recommendations. But I guess in hindsight, Suet, you want to add some thoughts around whether references to GIN and IRIS make sense based on our study?
Not directly, but the recommendation we made as right now is based on the surveyed FIs that we and the FIs that volunteer to participate to this study, and the recommendation are based on what we already have. So we don't directly plan on adapting, but that could be like another project, another study that we could tackle.
Yeah. Thanks, Suet. I think we have another question that came up. This is probably for all panelists. We take a couple of minutes, which is almost at the top of the hour before we close. To all panelists, do you think we can leverage GFANZ for Asia, especially in terms of participation in China and India?
Okay, maybe I'll start because I did make some reference to it earlier on. So China and India, we're going to see at least 10 trillion over the next 10 years, and that's a huge opportunity for investors. I think one thing also is when we talk about investments, there's always private and public investments, and it's about being able to capture it in the right strategy, create to create a different portfolio to be able to capture some of these. I would also think that the government push or how much the government is going to set aside a budget for, whether it's subsidies or it's about creating more job opportunities. So the government strategies, I think, for China has been very clear. Where they have a 2060 carbon neutral target. And from what we have seen is that China, when they say they're going to do something, they really work very hard towards trying to achieve those kind of targets. So I think there's a lot of forward-looking momentum going over there. But of course, think the market doesn't go up in a straight line. I think it's very clear that decarbonization needs to happen, and definitely the money needs to be flowing in that particular direction. And I think all the infrastructure investments that are going to be made between now and 2050, if not 2030, will need to have all these kind of emissions reduction consideration or certain targets like that. So I think that's where I would see investors having opportunities at.
Thanks, Idris. We are at the top of the hour, but just want to see if Sued and Anders, you have a quick 1 or 2 pointers to add on to Idris' point? No, I see we're good. Okay, great. So that brings us to the end. So I would say, you know, companies will be increasingly called on to share detailed transition plans with either their shareholders or to assess and even maintain their capital flow from investors. So really, we've heard this a lot of times, but it's still important to say and close with this. It's really time to deliver, and you know, investors and corporations all need to walk the talk. So thank you very much for your time, and the recording and resources will be shared after the webinar. So thank you for your time today. Thank you, Idris, Sued, and
Good day, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Cheers.
Bye.